Hello everyone, how are you doing? I'm Alfiza Dinda Amayuri with student number 021. I would like to present my analysis with the title The Rise of Humans' Hope from Despair in Thomas Hardy, The Darkling Thrush by applying the semiotic structuralism theory. But before that, let's get to know Thomas Hardy, or the poet of this poem first. Thomas Hardy was born on 2 June 1840 in the English village of Higher Bockhampton in the county of Dorset and died in 1928. Thomas Hardy was a great English novelist, architect, and poet. Through the poem of The Darkling Thrush, this research discovers an analysis using semiotic structuralism theory that contains several aspects of meaning. By applying Michael Rivateri's theory, it can be analyzed through one intrinsic element in the poem, namely symbols. The symbols in this poem will be explained by displacing, distorting, and creating meaning from the poem. And the theory used in this analysis is based on semiotic structural approach because the theory is considered to be able to explore the meaning contained in the poetry in depth. Semiotic is the study of sign systems. Signs in semiotics study are universal because they are everywhere. The meaning of poetry in this study was carried out using the Rivateri's meaning method, which was adapted to this research. So this analysis is applying two methods, which is heuristic and hermeneutic reading. Pradopo in 2005 states that one of the literary conventions regarding the indirectness of expression, according to Rivateri, is described by heuristic and hermeneutic reading methods. Heuristic reading is a poetry reading based on the language conventions, while hermeneutic reading is poetry reading based on the literary conventions. Heuristic reading is the first level of semiotic reading because the reading is only based on the conventions of society or the meaning of the language. Heuristic reading is done by translating or clarifying the meaning of words as well as synonyms, and if necessary, adding insertions in the poem is allowed. Retroactive or hermeneutic reading is rereading the given interpretation. This reading is a second level of semiotic reading because it uses literary conventions. Thus, poetry is not only understood from its linguistic meaning, but also from the literary meaning. Okay, next is the issue of the poem. The issue in the poem is about human adversity towards a life where the speaker's despair is in part of consequence of religious doubts. Perhaps the speaker is experiencing a crisis of faith, or the speaker's anxieties are related to the society more broadly. Hardy wrote the poem in 1900, and it seems to reflect on the previous century, describing it as a corpse, or the speaker may feel that society is falling or losing its promise, and that a return to religion will help restore it and give reason for hope. Alright, now let's move on to the symbols in the poem. The first symbol is the thrush. The thrush is a type of bird that first appears in the poem in the stanza 3. Thrush carries a significant symbolic of weight in the poem. Thrush is a symbol of hope. The thrush, which draws on the motif of the singing bird in romantic literature, represents hope. The speaker tells the reader as much in line 31, where he or she interprets the thrush's beautiful, cheerful song, hearing it in the knowledge of some blessed hope that stands apart from the bleak world of the poem otherwise describes. The hope that the thrush symbolizes also seems to be at last implicitly religious. The speaker consistently interprets the thrush song in religious terms, describing it as an evensong, the evening prayers in the Anglican Church, and as a blessed. Second symbol is frost. The speakers here is mentions the spectre gray, frost that marks the winter landscape. He or she is likely referring to the literal weather conditions, but frost is also symbolically rich because it damages plants and prevents them from growing. It symbolizes death itself because spring symbolizes renewal, rebirth, and resurrection. The frost stands in symbolically for the forces that block such rebirth, And in this poem, the frost likely symbolizes not just death, but also death in the absence of Christian resurrections, and death as a permanent and irreversible loss. Okay, next is sun or eye of the day. Eye of the day is a metaphor for the sun. Because it is round and bright, the sun is often compared to an eye in poetry, a comparison that personifies the sun or giving it the human characteristic. The weakening of the eye of the day suggests that fading and dying. The poet is watching the sunset and he sees the sun slowly disappearing, making the way for the cold night to arrive. Okay, the last one is lyre. A lyre is a stringed instrument or a small harp played with one hand. Traditionally, the lyre was the instrument played by Greek poets like Homer or Sappho to accompany their poems. Because of its close association with poetry, and because it is now rarely played, the lyre in the poem is almost always as a symbol of poetry itself, rather than a literal instrument. The lyre is a significant symbol which represents poetry and, more broadly, the cultural accomplishment of Western civilization. Okay, so now let's jump into the result and discussion. Alrighty, for the first is heuristic reading. When reading each stanzas, the poem was quite detailed. The language and diction that is used are mostly languages that could be understood at first glance or not having a complicated word. And it still contains of everyday language. For Hardy, the form gave him an intimacy with the English language and its deep history, which is especially useful for a poem critiquing contemporary English culture. That is why the reader could easily interpret what kind of poem the Darkling Thrush is without feeling confused with the meaning behind the words. And there are also several kinds of metaphorical language that were used by Hardy to deliver the message of this poem. Alright, the second is hermeneutic reading. So, looking at the poem begins with the speaker leaning upon a gate that opens into the woods. The act of leaning indicates that the speaker is tired and lost all hopes. The thrush represents hope, and the frost is as grey as ghost. There is no life around, and everything seems to be desolate. The frost, being the spectre grey, is a reference to the darkness that has spread all around the world towards the end of the 19th century. The sun is setting gradually and looks like the weakening eyes of the daylight. The stems of the shrubs looks like the broken strings of lyres. Okay, next topic is about displacing of meaning. So, displacing meaning is when a sign that appears have a hidden meaning behind it. This can be analyzed through one intrinsic element in the poem, namely symbols. Displacing of meaning can be interpreted when one sign has a double meaning, which in that case can be a metaphor or metonymy. So, I found the metaphor that is used in this poem, which are when the speaker is comparing the frost to a specter or a ghost or spirit. And then in line 2, the sun to an eye. And in line 4, in stanza 2, the speaker also compares the topographical features of the landscape. She or he surveys to a corpse, the cloudy sky to a crypt, and wind to the corpse's death lament, or the first instance could technically be considered a simile because of its use of the word seemed in line 9. But because these three instances of figurative languages are so closely linked to one another, it's much easier to think of them as three aspects of the same large metaphor. These metaphors follow a general pattern, with the exception of the fairly conventional metaphor comparing to the sun to the eye, and they each take a natural object or phenomenon and compare it to something that is dead and associated with death or ghost, corpses and tombs. These metaphors often personify the landscape and turning it into a human body and making it sounds into a human sounds. Then in a second layer of the metaphor, or nested with the first, these three metaphors makes the corpse into a symbol of the 19th century, now dead and entombed. And then the use of metaphor thus completely transforms to the landscape. It chooses to be an actual space and instead become a register of the speaker's sense to despair and desolation. In the second half of the poem, the speaker only uses one basic metaphor or the description of the thrush song as a human musical form. The speaker uses different words for different instances of this metaphor. For example, like carolings in line 25 or good night air in 30. But the most important instance falls in line 19, where the speakers describe the thrush song as evensong. Evensong is the set of evening prayers sung and chanted in Anglican churches. Once again, the metaphor transformed to a natural thing. In this case, a bird into a human thing, a religious ritual, and the metaphor suggests that the bird appears in the poem as an expression of religious feeling and human hope. So for the distorting of meaning, it's about the ambiguity in a poem. So the poem ends on an ambiguous note. Is the speaker inspired by the blessed hope of the thrush song, or does he continue to lack of optimism for the future? He is unaware of the thrush's reasons for being cheerful, right? And then he seems to believe that such a cause for hope exists somewhere, and he simply hasn't discovered it or rediscovered yet. And then this uncertainty is incompletely what assists with making the Darkling Thrush not just an ordinary Thomas Hardy's poem to peruse, yet additionally an incredible piece of poetry to examine. Not at all like the Thrush's carolings, Hardy's poem doesn't sound on completely a positive note. So for the last one is creating meaning. Rivateri explained that signs that appear have a structure that is out of the linguistic order, which initially didn't have any meaning. The creation of meaning in the form of meaning to everything that is in the common language is considered meaningless. For example, symmetry, rhyme, or semantic equivalence between homologues in a stanza. The creation of meaning occurs because organization of text space, including enjambment, typography, and homologue. In this poetry, I've found the enjambment. The Darkling Thrush uses enjambment in a distinctive and significant pattern. In the first two stanzas, the poem generally alternates enjambed and end-stopped lines. For example, line 5 is enjambed, line 6 is end-stopped. This unit of enjambment and end-stop correspond with the poem's metrical units. Each pair of iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter lines forms its own grammatical unit that concludes with an end stop, and then this pattern repeats in line 7 and 8 and holds throughout the first half of the poem, except line 10 to 12, where each line is end stopped. In the first half of the poem, the end stops are never farther than 2 lines apart. Alright, we come to the last part of my analysis, which is conclusion. So, The Darkling Thrush is a great winter poem which was first published on 29 December in 1900. As the writer of this poem, Thomas Hardy gave his reflects based on the event that happened in the 19th century, and his own sentiments about the future, also about his disposition to the nature. This analysis applies the structural theory of semiotics, where there are 4 methods: heuristic and hermeneutic reading, displacing of meaning, distorting of meaning, and creating meanings. Me, as the writer, have analyzed an intrinsic element in the poem named symbols, and then it can be inferred that through heuristic reading, each stanza in the poem was quite detailed, and then the language, also the diction that is used, are mostly languages that could be understood at first glance or not having complicated wording. It still contains of everyday language. Meanwhile, for the hermeneutic reading, the speaker is depicted as a person who is tired and has lost all of his hopes. There are many symbols that being a reference to the darkness that has spread all around the world towards the end of the 19th century, and almost to despair, but all lost because there is still hope, which is shown by the nature through the melodious song by the thrush. The displacing meaning shown the metaphor, which means it gives the value to the meaning contained in the poetry. And then the distorting of meaning shown by the ambiguity of the next next step that will be taken by the speaker, whether to move directly or not. And then last but not least is the creating meaning shown through the enjambment in a distinctive and significant pattern from each line. And from all of these materials, we can formulate the theme of this poem that is about nature is one of the sources that shows the emergence of hope for humans when experiencing despair. Alright, finally we come to the end of my analysis. I hope you can get my explanation crystal clear. Thank you for watching and stay safe. Bye!